Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes, you're audible. Prime Minister, if you're speaking, you're inaudible.
I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The mountains are melting, the polar bears are drowning. So if radicalization means that we get less support or buy-in from just the general public, then we're very happy to oppose this entirely. So just some framing before we move on to our argument on just buy-in. First, what does this radicalization reasonably look like? Radicalization might look like the intent on gaining public awareness through controversy and civil disobedience. It looks like going on social media and flooding the entire feed with short form content because we need to be controversial to gain attention because people just generally have short attention spans. So things like blocking roads by supergluing yourself onto like major highways and so on. And oftentimes, the victims of these actions are just average individuals living their lives, i.e., the environmental movement takes action that targets the individual that they are trying to convince in the first place. And also, radicalization often loads their messaging with things like shame, where you feel like it's needed to get people to change because guilt based messaging is just extremely very emotive and oftentimes not representative of the real situation at hand. This looks like exaggerated messaging. For example, when you use, like, for every one straw you use, one turtle dies, we think these kinds of things want to shame people into believing in their social movements. But the second thing, on what are the conditions by which social movements are generally effective? We probably think it's first of all on buy-in, where people have to be willing to participate in the movement. We'll prove this later. But the second thing on attention, where we say that people generally have to know about the movement, but in this framing that we bring you, we say that people already know about the movement, and therefore it's reasonable that we do get organic change, like through things like regular activism, like, which we think this debate is actually about. And we think this for two reasons. One, that climate change or like issues on the environment are very visible and very proximate in the sense that we feel the effects of climate change already. For example, the average person is already aware that the environmental movement exists and there's already an impetus for organic change through moderate activism. But the second reason, on voter based spectrumization, that those who don't support the movement won't support it anyways, and those who do already support it. And so we think that it's more about the middle ground in this debate, people who aren't on the extreme sides of the spectrum, i.e., it's about people who have other priorities and are unsure that they want to disrupt these priorities to support an environmental movement. Like, for example, linking the economic benefits more than the environmental policies, but not exactly hating the environmental supporters and so on. Then, on the last point of framing, on our counterfactual, we think it looks like regular activism. So, things like protests, things like going on social media and telling people the statistics on global warming and so on. We just think these are just incredibly very reasonable and logical. But the second thing, that there is already a necessary impetus for change to occur, given that again the impacts are very proximate, but there's also sufficient coverage on national disasters, on news outlets, and so on. So we think that through things like the internet, through globalization, there's already a quick dissemination of information that already exists. Then moving on to our main argument on buy-in. So the premise of this claim, why is buy-in extremely important? We just think that if it's true that you get more buy-in, you just get a lot more critical mass, which we think is the mechanism by which you get genuine attention from the right demographic, the right people who are willing to be invested and to support your movement, because we think this is the pathway for legislative change. But onto the more important parts, the mechanisms by which you get more buy-in. But we say that radicalization gets a lot less buy-in for a couple of reasons. The first reason, that even if people know about these movements, the cost benefit analysis they run on being associated with the movement itself is one that turns people away from actively participating in these movements, in the sense that these people often care about other things as well. They do not have that much incentive to really search more into things because reasonably they know that the environment is important to a certain extent, just that they don't believe that it's important enough to change their lifestyles for it. In the sense that one, the radicalization process tends to be very fast, i.e., they see like things that are controversial and they see disrupting social stability and by extension disrupting other priorities. That's something that's extremely that they're very averse to. And this is a trade-off they make extremely quickly, given that they're already on the fence, and it's not worth the additional effort to research more into the environment, given that they would realistically not see the radicalized movement as to be just as important as other things like economic stability already. The second reason that they feel they have to be like just as radical to join, which is an incredibly high hurdle for a lot of people to meet. Next, they don't want to be associated with radicalization, which is very likely to happen should they choose to support the movement, given that this controversy is likely to become the face of this movement. They become the external third-party harm when people associate these people with more radical movements. And the next thing, that shame is a mechanism that is incredibly problematic because we feel that people just don't want to be attacked, and so they respond to these movements defensively by attacking the movement or viewing this as a threat to their own lives. And all of this is important because this means that the first impressions are oftentimes extremely important as a prerequisite to buy-in. And note how this preemptively blocks out opposition's case as the awareness given that we break the mechanism between how awareness leads to increased belief and buy-in on movement. Then the next reason on why radicalization gets a lot less buy-in, on the idea of proximity and priority, where the direct consequences of the actions of your radical movement are a huge disruption to public peace. This looks like the Just Stop Oil movement, where they throw tomato soup onto like Vincent van Gogh paintings, or they glue themselves onto the roads to disrupt traffic, for example. We say that people who are directly affected will likely care about the extent to which they're affected a lot more than the intent of these movements, which we say are already incredibly unclear. For example, people can't usually draw the links between throwing tomato soup on art galleries to like gaining more traction for their environmental movement. They don't see how this actively changes or affects legislative change in a way that's meaningful. And so all they see is a phase of just havoc and disruption. We think people are generally extremely averse to this. The third reason that these people feel an obligation to participate in civil disobedience. And the key premise that we're pushing is that the people who are in these radical movements do this almost religiously, in the sense that they feel as if what they're doing is extremely morally justified. That if you don't participate in these movements, you're morally complicit in the death of the earth. Where, for example, even though climate change is just a consequence of maybe living normally in an industrially modernized world, we don't think just a single person can be blamed for all of this. The radical movements might not share the same opinion or the same intent, and therefore it's the pressure to be radical. You have an obligation to be extreme, which we think is an incredibly high hurdle for just regular people that they're not willing to sacrifice. For all these reasons, very proud to propose.
Thank you for that fine speech, Prime Minister, to start the clash for side opposition, calling on leader of opposition.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, give me a moment. My speech starting in 3, 2, 1. I'm gonna tell you 3 things in my speech today. I'm gonna tell you firstly what this situation really looks like, what status quo really looks like in terms of the environmental movement, and secondly, I'm gonna directly clash with side government here before moving to my first sentence to why we still think that if there's more harm, it does more good than harm in the long term, and why this is something that is very urgent and something that the environmental movement needs, and is the only thing that can actually lead to greater change or lead to even more awareness or leads to a greater change on the individuals who have the most power, right? Firstly, my key pieces of framing, 2 things I'm going to tell you. Firstly, how does status quo really actually look like? They try to tell you that, oh, everybody technically already knows, and fine, we agree on that terms. However, we would like to readdress that even if there's awareness, the intention towards the urgency of climate change is not directly reflected on how effective it is towards changing the attitudes of individuals who has the most power and can directly support the environmental movement, such as individuals who are most likely the wealthiest individuals, the individuals who are most likely the CEOs who are making the investment in, for example, investing within fossil fuels towards their companies. And the reason why these individuals, we say, are most likely the environmental movement main priority is because they have the most power, they have the most change in creating the policies, in creating the legislation to even make their company in the very first place a green company or in terms of the government, will even create policies that will make sure that these companies will actually abide to those laws and make sure in the long term that by directly pressuring and directly impacting the individuals who has the most power will then have this trickle down effect, which will then enact in the long term have a green awareness. And the reason why we tell you that individuals are less likely to even support the movement, however, we must change them, is for three reasons. Firstly, these individuals are rich, these individuals are wealthy, they can afford the impacts of climate change. However, this does not undermine the fact that there's other people who are also suffering from it. And the second thing we tell you is that these people are the people who are directly contributing towards climate change. These individuals look like those who are indirectly investing within fossil fuels. These individuals look like who are directly supporting things that directly clash with the environmental movement. And the third thing we tell you is that the environmental movement has never been taken seriously. Sure, there's a bunch of awareness. Sure, like people know about the climate change. However, it has never been taken seriously as an actual movement. And these rich individuals have not felt the incentive to even help them in the very first place. And it's only the everyday people. But we tell you, what can these everyday people even do? Because note that side government here has never proved to you what these individuals can do. Because note that when you have these minor individuals, they can never ever rise against the rich individuals or the top 1% who actually has the power to help climate, who actually has the power to even change climate change for the better, right? So we tell you that ultimately radicalization helps put weight and urgency onto these individuals. It pressures them, and it's the only way to fight back against the status quo. And we tell you that this is in turns the environmental movement the only last act of defense. Because note that we have seen countless years that sure, even if the environmental movement is gaining awareness, we tell you that it's not getting enough attention, is not getting enough change from those who has the most power because they have been constantly ignored. Or in terms of what the government has shown you in the entire case today, is that they're going to try and target the people in the middle ground. And so what? Because even if it's the people in the middle ground, how much change can they even do? So this brings me to my second piece of frame to what radicalization really means. We tell you that it does not, we tell you two things. It does not really mean violence. It doesn't really mean shame. Why? Because their actions doesn't really directly harm anyone. It's only a public disruption. And yes, we even address that it can be in terms of peaceful protest. And the second thing we tell you is that they're most likely going to target the individuals who are the greatest contributors towards climate change, because that is under the incentive of the environmental movement, because they would want to target those who have the most power to even support them in the first place, or has the most power to even stop climate change from increasing even more. And we tell you that not only is this what the environmental would want, but in terms of the majority in the public side, this will be symbolic towards them, because now they are targeting those who have the most power, and they're not just only like just guilt shaming the individuals. So we tell you that's going to be much more impactful and empowering for the environmental movement. So just one quick response, even though I haven't directly responded with side government, is that sure, fine, even if we lose the trade of losing the people in the middle ground, they have not shown you about what these individuals can even do, because we tell you that these individuals are most likely going to be the minority, because like they said in their own setup, people are aware of the environmental movement, people are taught about it, people are already know about it and want to create change. However, we tell you that on our side, this radicalization just means it looks like it's targeting the people who has the most power, not these individuals. And therefore, they can't really say that they're going to target the middle ground, because if technically everyone is all aware, then why does this small amount of middle ground people are going to matter? Like, what does it contribute towards the bigger change of actually pressuring on these people? Like, what? Because understand that and note that if you're just going to show statistics, if you're just going to be peaceful about it, you're going to show everybody, oh my gosh, the rate of I don't know, melting iceberg is increasing every year. What does this really mean towards those who can actually create change? Is this going to be another statistic? And note that even if this is true, it's going to take a long while for this to even garner change in the very first place. And under the rate of climate change, we tell you that as something that we do not want. So this brings me to my first substantive and my only one, to why this urgency is needed, and why this urgency is in fact created on our side, and we tell you that it actually brings in more good, right? Okay, two things I'm going to tell you. Firstly, we know that radicalization can work and have already worked in the past. We've seen the women's suffrage has fought for women's voting rights, and in fact they changed, and they're known as the most radical social movement. And the reason why these people even bought into the idea of the women's suffrage in the very first place, it was because they were seen as empowering. Why they were seen as empowering? Because they were directly targeting those who were in power, directly targeting those individuals who have, caused them to not have the rights to vote in the very first place. And we tell you that radicalization is the only way for the environmental movement to even reinforce themselves into these reinforce themselves into the market, or reinforce themselves as something that needs to be taken care of by the wealthier people. And the second thing we tell you is that it puts pressure on the right people. Because sure, people can eventually address it, but by the time they do it, it will only be those individuals who are like the normal citizens. And we tell you, what can these normal citizens even do? We tell you that if they really want to cause change, and in fact they have been directly protesting against those who invest in fossil fuels, these are the only way in which radicalization can help the environmental movement. We tell you that this is the only way for them to even garner the change from the right people and put pressure on the right people, which in fact will then create change, because they have to deal, they have to address, and eventually they would have to know and address these protests. And we say that by radicalization, because you're doing it on a greater extreme extent, we tell you that that is the only way for them to improve. So so proud to oppose.
Thank you for that fine speech, LO. To extend the clash on government side, DPM. DPM, whenever you're ready.
Hi, can I check that I'm audible? Okay.
Yes, you.
Okay. All right. Okay. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, the case of opposition is like the polar ice caps. You first look at it, it feels pretty solid, it feels pretty good. The longer you look at it, the longer you scrutinize it, you realize that parts of it are melting away until it eventually dissolves into absolutely nothing. The case on opposition is one that's extremely convoluted and confusing. They don't exactly tell you what this radicalization looks like. They say it looks like targeting the rich. Notice number one, how this doesn't beat out Lauren's initial framing about how this probably looks like mechanisms like you gluing yourself onto roads, stopping cars, how this is like extreme messaging, and how this looks like shaming. They tell you they stop the rich. They don't give you a mechanism for how they change the action of the rich and powerful. But secondly, they tell you they want awareness. They tell you they want urgency. In the same breath, they tell you that the public doesn't matter because the public can't do anything. Note, if the public doesn't matter in this debate, I don't get what this debate actually is about. But secondly, I think it's extremely obvious and extremely intuitive to the strength that the critical mass has in any form of social movement. I think just look at precedents. They want to talk about the women's suffrage movement. Why did the movement succeed? Because women all across the world banded together because they believed in this, because even the men believed in this. The way you get any movement to succeed, the way you change society, is to change the views of the people that make up that society to eventually change what people think. You need numbers because society is made out of people, not made out of money. 2 responses. Number 1, why awareness is something that is symmetric. We already explained to you why you don't get awareness on their side, because we've already explained to you through mechanisms like self-defense, like how people feel incredibly self-defensive when you shame them, when you tell them the world is going to burn down, when you tell them they're complicit. The immediate human response is one of shutting off your message. We've already told you about how it's very easy for things like the extreme right to frame out your message at the point in which they paint you as radical. This crucially means that the ideas of agency, the ideas of change that they want to talk about don't happen. But secondly, I don't think it's something that's exclusive, because I don't know the nuance here. Us not being radicalized, us having a more like toned down mellow environment movement, doesn't mean that we don't tell that this is an urgent issue. It means that the kinds of messaging changes. It means that we don't shame you. It means that we tell you that, look, polar caps are melting. By 2030, the environment atmosphere might be like this. We think we ought to do these things, and we think this will help the environment. No, thank you. There's a difference in messaging. There's a difference in the kind of messaging, but we think we can push for urgency as well. But next, let me talk about this ridiculous claim where you say they want to change the behavior of CEOs. The first thing to take note of is the question of why are CEOs the ones probably responsible for the most amount of environmental degradation in the first place. I think we just need to examine the incentive structure of these CEOs, because it's one where they work in huge conglomerate companies, one where they through processes like corporate lobbying, they're able to avoid a lot of political responsibility, where they're able to have a lot of opaque structures and corruption behind the scenes, where they're able to exploit a lot of people, where they're able to cause a lot of harm towards the environment. But crucially, because a lot of times cheap things like fossil fuels cost a lot less money than renewable energy, because a lot of their businesses are ones that eventually harm the environment, but because they still want to make money, because they need to like have ownership towards their shareholders, and they need to make the company get better so they earn their bonuses. We think the incentive structures don't change on either side, because judge, the mechanism they tell you right now, the extent of their mechanization is that a bunch of people will go to really rich CEOs and they will write on their social media Reddit posts, hey, this CEO damn bad, he like not environmentally friendly. And then the CEO will read it and go, hey, actually, I think also quite bad. I think let me change my actions. Let me overhaul what my company is all about. And let me just start being really environmentally friendly. I don't get how they get any form of recognition for change, seeing as how CEOs are able to easily shrug this off. And this is even worse on their side because CEOs can paint them as radical. We think, and the flip here, Judge, is that comparatively on our side, we give you two mechanisms in which we stop the most powerful. The first is on the idea of accountability through critical mass, because we tell you, sure, the mechanism of shaming and putting pressure on corporations is one that might work, but it doesn't work if it's just a small group of individuals writing some articles on a blog post. It works through things like numbers. It works through things like, for example, on Instagram, where you repost and you talk about how, for example, a certain company is cutting down too many trees in the rainforest, and thousands and millions of people share that post again. These are the numbers that you need to put pressure on the movement. And Lauren has already explained to you how on our side, and this is something they concede, we get more numbers because the messaging is one that's a lot more palatable, because something that a lot of people can accept. So therefore, we tell you we get more accountability for these CEOs on our side. But I think secondly, it's incredibly hard for the court of public opinion, for public pressure, to change their actions. We think the most definite and the most proximate way to change their actions is by changing the laws. It's by implementing more environmental laws to change the way they act, because if they don't act in this way, they will get punished and they will be deemed as criminals. We think uniquely on our side, we have the critical mass to enact political change, to enact laws that actually force the CEOs and hold them beholden to the harms that they're putting onto the environment. So, two extensions I want to run. Number one, why getting more bias is important for political change. And secondly, why independent of the environment, causing third-party harm to like people who are not directly complicit is something that's incredibly unjust. And lastly, just something on the trade-off. So the premise of the first claim is that you oftentimes get fragmentation within this movement. Because a piece of framing the opposition needs to understand is that there's intersectionality within the environmental movement, which means that some people within the movement are really radical. Some people within the movement just generally believe environmentalism. They all have different ideas and thoughts within the movement. At the point in which you paint the movement as one that's incredibly radical, they want to push sorts of extreme messaging. We think you get fragmentation and infighting within the movement. We think some people within the movement support you, some people within the movement don't support you. You waste a lot of political capital. You become a lot more immobile as a motion. This is the point in which you waste a lot of capital. This is the point which become a lot more inefficient. But secondly, they don't ever beat out Lawrence mechanism about how you get more critical mass. We've already told you about how oftentimes a lack of critical mass means you don't have political pressure, because it means you are unable to have a lot of people to force the government to change things. But secondly, and importantly, we think the kinds of people or the kinds of politicians that are against environmental change are people like Trump, are people on the radical right. We think at the point which you portray yourself as a radical, as part of the radical left, it's extremely easy for them to weaponize this narrative and push against you, to oppose you, to ridicule you, and to mock you, for you to do some support base among the most common people. Next, I want to explain to you why causing third-party harm is bad. So, the characterization of radicalization, something they don't challenge, looks like one where you disrupt the public order. It looks like one where you disrupt people's day-to-day lives. It looks like one where you cause harm to people, you cause inconvenience to them, you stop them from working their jobs, which bring them food on the table. We think the instances in which civil disobedience is justified is one where, number one, the people were directly complicit. Number two, when people had put the keys to change were directly within the palms of people, which is that people could change because the result of this discrimination was the cause of people's actions. But I think thirdly was one that was a direct violation of human rights that was in status quo. So we think for regimes like the apartheid regime, we think Martin Luther King's like revolts, for example, we think these things are all justified. But we think comparatively, you are born into a morally arbitrary world here. We think oftentimes, even if people were complicit in the environment, it was not their fault, because they were born into a system of capitalism and a system of consumerism that demanded that they do so. So we think, therefore, it's unjust to shame them. We think you'd rather get them on board to help with the movement to enact some actual change. For that, I said, incredibly proud to propose.
Thank you for that speech, DPM, to extend the clash inside opposition, calling on leader of opposition.
Big water soda.
Hello, can you hear me clearly?
Yes, clear and audible.
All right, that's great. All right, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Government's whole case falls the moment they assume that because they'll have more numbers and more acknowledgement, government's whole case falls when they simply assume that everyone already knows climate change. Therefore, everyone is simply comfortable with just sharing facts on the internet and stating what's happening and what's going on in the world. Therefore, they garner more numbers, more acknowledgement, and more change in the future just because people are mind-numbingly absorbing facts on the internet. That is where they fail to realize that no one will actually stand up and take action simply because of this. Now, let me go through a few of my rebuttals first before I want to talk about my 2 important points. Firstly, government has painted on us that since people are already aware and these regular people don't really have much power to do anything and they don't care, by us shaming them, it's actually really bad and unjustifiable of us for doing that. However, they're only talking about social media here. And even if we just simply share facts on the internet, we don't really believe that anyone will do anything in the first place. This is why we think that controversial acts will actually garner more traction. There's a reason why they're labeled as controversial, simply because more people will now actually realize and understand what people are doing in the real world. They'll be forced to acknowledge that the reason why we took these acts and all these maybe acts are simply because we want to stand up and speak out for the environment, which affects billions of people in our world. This is why we actually have to go look to these controversial acts. They've also stated on their side that there's already good coverage on social media on natural disasters. Therefore, people will understand the fact that environmental change is an important thing. However, what's this is looking like on social media when news outages cover natural disasters, this looks like them only covering the impacts of these natural disasters. It doesn't look like them covering the reasons why these natural disasters took place, which is exactly why nobody actually realizes the dire cause and the dire problem, which is environmental problems that we actually need to fix and join. They've also stated that people will feel like it's too radical for them to join. However, we believe through these radical acts, these will actually reinforce the urgency in people's mind to actually take smaller steps and smaller changes. For example, using one less plastic bag or one less plastic straw. And this brings me to my really important point about the image of the environmental movement. And they've painted on us a radical image, just like many others have. However, in your minds, you do realize, and everyone underlyingly realizes the urgency of this movement. And this, I believe, truly believe, that this radicalization is the only way we can instill this urgency within the back of people's minds. Because when you think of these radicalized movements and these controversial movements, you will now think and you will know the urgency and the dire need we actually need to stand up for it. Because believing in the cause up to a very point you will actually take action and do something that is deemed by the public crazy and radical means how much it shows the public how much it means to you as an individual, simply because you have chosen to do these acts out of your own accord, which shows how much you believe in the movement itself. Therefore, it does paint a positive image of urgency within people's minds. Even if they don't realize it at first, it does go to show how much these individuals who take these actions believe in them. I also want to state how government has also mentioned the BLM movement and Martin Luther King and their peaceful protests. However, this is only because they already had more numbers and more people in first who were willing to stand up and take action and go walk to the White House to protest for their rights. However, this is not what it looks like in our current day society, because people in our society are comfortable the way they are. They're comfy in their houses, and these look like people who are more preoccupied with their life at the moment. Therefore, they're unlikely to actually opt into the environmental movement, which affects everyone in the world even worse. Therefore, we need these controversial things simply because we need to reach these people who believe that they're comfortable enough within their homes, which leads me to my second point after the urgency and image point. People's reaction to the radicalization and why we get more buy-in on our side, even at a smaller marginal amount, simply because of the image we painted of urgency. It does result in spreading this movement to more people and achieving more buy-in in the first place. Even though, yes, we do acknowledge their initial reaction could be a mixture of shock, being taken aback, stunned, confused, and maybe slightly distressed.
However, we believe that later on, these people will actually understand the factors and why it pushed these people who took these very actions to actually take them and do them, which is the environmental movement and why we need to do this. Simply because when you see these controversial movements, of course, that you'll actually want to know their intent and why they've actually done it. It's not as government paints it that people will only simply look at them and think of them as crazy people. No, this is in fact the opposite. When you see these instances and these crazy cases that you deem crazy on the internet, you will obviously want to look behind the intent and the person who took it and why they took it. For example, when the first case of a person who first tried to throw food onto the Mona Lisa and things like that. When more of these cases popped up, these people people online are starting to look behind the intent of these people who've actually continuously done it. And now you're starting to realize that the reason and the steps they took to do it was simply because they want to show the urgency of the environmental movement and why we need it. Therefore, I'm going to go through 3 stakeholders today as well. Firstly, the general public. In government's world, everyone is simply comfortable just absorbing these statistics on the internet and not taking any change. However, in our world, when we have these radical movements and acts, the general public will now be forced to conform. They'll not only conform, but actually acknowledge this because it's on the internet and they see it in news coverages even more. And this is different from just reading statistics about how icebergs are melting. This is because this is actually now happening within the society itself, not somewhere far away in Antarctica. Now, this is happening just like throwing food on the Mona Lisa. They will now need to understand why they're affected by this because it's like foreshadowing the impact and the ginormous impact of the environmental movement as a whole. Therefore, the general public will now these acts are actually now able to reach the general public even better because now you're actually seeing people do something for them and you're actually seeing why they do something for the environmental movement, which is so important. Next thing, I also want to talk about corporations. And they've also said that the corporations can simply paint the movement as radical. However, we believe this is almost impossible because as the radical movement progresses, the corporations and CEOs themselves will actually have to address it. They can't just brush it over. It actually exposes those companies who actually don't care about the environment. And it paints them in a bad light for not responding to these movements and other things. For example, how people sued Shell for having a lot of pollution and lot of emissions. People actually were able to take this action because these movements and Shell did not respond to it, and they're able to expose the corporations for not actually doing anything to support the environmental movement. Secondly, we also believe that this will reach the wealthy people also. They will also, when they see more of these radical and controversial movements, because they most of the time have the luxury to peruse the internet and see what they want to see, they actually will now probably feel more inclined to take these actions. For example, donating to environmental movements and changes to like pick up trash or clean the forests and other things. They'll actually be able to donate to these and they'll feel better in themselves, even though it could be for their personal gain. They will also actually indeed be contributing to the environment as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech, Diallo. To end the clash for side government, calling on GovWhip.
Hi, can I just confirm that everyone can hear me?
Yep, perfectly clear.
Recently, Singapore hit like a freaking 36-degree high. Oh no, sorry, 38-degree high. And I thought it was really, really hot. And I think reasonably the average individual can feel these kind of impacts and think, oh man, maybe climate change is really getting to be a big of a problem, right? I think reasonably, opposition cannot simply come up here and say that, oh, people just don't sense the urgency right now. I think that's a blatant mischaracterization of status quo. I think the average individual knows that climate change is a problem. The average individual knows that if they don't do anything now, these problems will eventually compound on them and they will suffer from the impacts, right? So 2 things I'm going to do in this debate. Firstly, I'm going to clarify what exactly opposition has to defend, because on their side, they say somehow that they still have peaceful protests, people will somehow still get involved. I don't think that's a trade-off that is like reasonable for them to take. I think reasonably what actually happened on the outside is peaceful protest. I don't think it's just going to be social media as what opposition wants to push forward. I think we're going to get acts of protest that are still within reasonable like societal boundaries, but at the very same time, it doesn't cause civil disobedience. Opposition here then has a burden to bite the bullet and tell you why civil disobedience is the delta in this debate. I don't think they focus on this to begin with. Now,
First thing I'm going to cover, who exactly are the main stakeholders in the debate, i.e. who is likely to change. Lauren already preemptively blocks out this rich CEOs argument. Realistically, your biggest polluters of climate change is your rich CEOs. We agree. But Hao Ming then gives you 4 reasons why they are stagnant to change and unlikely to change in the first place, right? Firstly, political lobbying, things like corruption, things like colluding with presidents by funding their campaigns to put a halt on like environmental policies. These are actions that happen in the status quo that prevent these kind of change from happening to begin with. Secondly, control of media. We tell you there's extreme polarization in status quo. Dissemination of information over the actions of rich people is often very silent and unknown, given that nobody wants to target the rich CEO who realistically runs your newspaper company. A, they can buy their way out of paying news outlets, maybe they own the news outlets to begin with. B, echo chambers, this polarization and incentive structure of social media companies who are also, rich CEOs, specifically manufacture your FYP to align your views, which gives people arrogant confidence to target other people who hold opposing viewpoints. This means that even in the dissemination, the dissemination of information, which is crucial in the way that people decide what to talk about, accountability to the rich is often left out when people are guided to turn against each other. Like fourthly, fear of the rich. I want a job, I want money, I want livelihood. I think between targeting the rich CEOs and the environmental movement as a whole, I am likely to target the latter, given that I'm afraid of facing the consequences of targeting the rich. Similarly, this goes for radicalization that occurs in the environmental movement, right? I think that radicalization is less likely to target the average individual because there is likely going to be far less personal backlash by blocking a car of a salaryman going home from work than blocking Donald Trump's car because I'm afraid of getting shot. I think this is important because it lowers the degree of accountability that is put on rich CEOs and magnifies the harm that Lauren tells you to the average individual that turns them against the environmental movement as a whole. And fourth reason, changing production processes are very, very complicated and long. As a CEO, would I want to change my entire decades-long production process if a person blocks my car? Am I far more likely to exert control on society through the other mechanisms that I've already explained, right? I think that because of all these reasons, I think their first argument already falls. I don't think that they sufficiently engaged with this. I think Hao Ming already took this argument out, right? But I think the second clarification here, why then is the average individual important? I think the first thing here, right? Policies are created by political pressure. Your government that has the ability to control these corporations to begin with is dependent on what the public wants because they want to cater to their voter base. They want to actually get these kind of votes, right? I think this is something that Lauren already preempts you. We tell you why then is the average individual so important? Why is it that this middle ground is so important, right? Op then runs a case where on our side, we only see the impacts. People don't care about the intentions on why the polar cap is melting, right? I think there's 2 responses to this. First response, A, is a contradiction, right? Because opposition cannot simultaneously claim that the average individual is not important, but then also suddenly try to claim that they are important in DLO, right? I think that's a contradiction. Are they important or not? Please answer this. B, I think then this framing is symmetric at their best and worse at their worst. Because reasonably, I see the impacts of people standing in front of my car. Why would I care about what they are doing this for, right? Lauren gives you 3 reasons why I would be even more disengaged and opposed to the environmental movement when I see that illogicality. I think that action is even more illogical than assuming that sea levels are rising because of climate change. I think that is a very understanding that the impacts of climate change is very, very intuitive. I don't see why standing in front of a car is just as intuitive. I think reasonably on our side, people are more likely to care about intentions than opposition side, right? And the only response they have to this is that they assert that these people will understand later on their side. But that's just all it is. An assertion. They don't give me reasons why this is likely to be true. Second response, they don't give me reasons why we can't get that same urgency towards solving environmental issues on our side, right? We already told you why we will. Singapore very, very hot. I feel very, very hot. I think this impact is very proximate already. I think there's so much focus on this kind of impacts crashing on us later on. I think there is so much more pressure that's already being put, even when you have organic change, right? Even if we don't, right? Here's where Hao Ming already told you, right? Critical mass then is the delta in this debate, especially when it comes to the environmental movement for a couple of reasons. First one being, you want to change the government. I'm sorry, the government does not listen to the minority because they cannot afford to listen to a small group of radicalized individuals over the general need of the public. Secondly, you want to create a kind of movement that the government wants to work with. Because I'm sorry, but I don't think the government wants to work with criminals or rebels to public society, right? I think it's precisely because you want to create an environmental movement that the government has to work with. That's why it's so important that the reputation of the environmental movement stays good. Why is this important? Because environmental policies, as opposition concedes, it's not something that the average individual can take on alone. The reason why the average individual is so important is not because they can change their own individual actions, but because we want to make them invested into actually putting political pressure on the government to actually implement policies that change. What does this look like? It looks like having policies to target corporations, right? To tell them to stop producing so much. It looks like corporate implementing more carbon taxes. These are the kind of policies that you require the government to step in. I think reasonably, one, they are unlikely to listen to a small group of radicalized individuals over like other priorities such as like economic policies. But two, I think if you want the environmental movement to be able to push forward like these kind of policies, you need the government to support you. I think insofar as opposition does not prove that the government has an incentive to implement these policies in the first place, and they don't prove why they get any form of real change on their side, it's a point where they lose this debate, right? But I think here's what I'm going to do a quick trade-off, right? Even if we assume that opposition has actually provided us any mechanism as to why their side actually gets changed and they want to like push for this urgency argument, right? Here's where we're willing to trade off this urgency argument for like for the environmental movement, right? Because I think there's two reasons here. First reason being we want to talk about the sustainability of the movement, right? Because reasonably, environmental issues will always be a problem. Environmental issues will always haunt us. We will always be facing the impacts of climate change. But I think when you get a small group of radicalized individuals, this means that it's unlikely for the movement to be sustainable insofar as they are unable to get consistent buy-in from the general public. This means that even if you get a very, very short period of time where this movement is very, very good, people really believe this movement is radicalized, this does not mean that this same amount of support is going to continue on in the future. Second reason here, I think it's principally unjustified to put pressure on the wrong kinds of people, right? I think the average individual is not solely responsible for sea levels rising or like the temperature increasing, right? I think the fact of the matter is the people who are at the brunt of this civil disobedience is going to be your average salaryman, it's going to be your average individual. I think it's principally unjustified because you hurt people who are innocent, you hurt people who actually have done nothing wrong to you, you actually divert political pressure and accountability from those who matter. For all these reasons, proposition.
Thanks for that speech, Golvip. To end the clash in opposition, calling on uplift.
Before I begin my speech, I take a roll POIs, and my pronouns is he, him. I'm going to begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. So in my speech, I'll be doing a few things for you. The first thing I'll be doing is I'll be going through my rebuttals. Then I'll be going through some examples I'd like to show. And lastly, I'm going to talk about comparison of both worlds and why we won. So first of all, let me go through my rebuttals. So the whip stated that urgency has to be solved. Needs to be solved, and it's both on both sides of the world. This awareness and urgency is both, and she gave me an example of Singapore being hot. So let me give you a bit of reason here. First of all, even though people understand, people know, everyone can agree that people know about climate change. Are they really dealing with the problem? And I say no, people aren't dealing with the problem. You have to understand that in human society, humans are inherently lazy. They do not want to work hard to solve a change that will happen years before after their lifetime, and they believe that they could just live their lifetime and let the future generation deal with this problem. And I don't need to explain to you why this is a bad mentality, as we know that we should solve the world so we can save other lives in the future. So how are we going to solve this problem of where people do not really care about dealing with climate change? So what if Singapore is hot? They'll just on the bloody aircon. I don't think that's a real huge problem that you're really bringing. And later I'll give more clear examples of what really works. So since people are inherently lazy and they do not really want to work for the opportunity to be able to solve climate change, how are we on our side of the house going to make them do this instead of their side where they're not really going to do much except ordering the damn aircon? The reason why it works more on our side is because, let's say I'm scrolling on YouTube, because you have to understand, our current generation is very into looking at social media. And when social media is being portrayed as a very negative, people only look at social media when it's very extreme and there's a lot of things being shown, a lot of drama being shown. If I'm scrolling on YouTube and I suddenly see that soup is being thrown at the Mona Lisa, I will get hooked. I will research the idea. I will go through and see why this soup is being thrown. And eventually my understanding of climate change is going to be there, okay? And once this understanding of climate change is going to be there, what's going to happen? Two things are going to happen. The first thing is, once I've gained understanding of climate change and I understand how urgent it is, the chances of me actually having to put in action will have to be there. And secondly, you keep stating of how people will get deterred from not doing it. But I'm on my phone. I'm seeing this drama from my phone. Maybe a few people at the museum might get upset, or the individuals who put up that painting might get upset, but the mass majority will understand. So I would like to quickly address the point you made about individualism. The reason why individualism is there, because you have to understand, in a movement, you need many people, and you have to touch individual people to make them into a movement. And we are touching these people through various ways, as I just explained. So when it comes to the thing about individual, we believe it's true. Furthermore, she also stated a lot about how the government will not listen to us, will not listen to the minority, and will not work with people who are. No, let me give you a few nails and answers. I would like you to explain to me why that in 2019 the UK had declared climate change as an emergency after having radical movements. I want you to explain that to me later on in your reply speech. But I think that's a reason why that happens. The reason why that the government does listen is because first of all, the government will have to understand why their citizens are doing this, why the citizens are disrupting, and obviously it'll bring more attention to the government. They cannot run the country if the citizens are not being cooperative with running them. Furthermore, you need to understand that with our motion, since more people are going to join these radical movements, there will not be a minority, and it's a majority of people who are trying to push it. And there's been a lot of evidence where this has actually happened. So far, what has government given you in terms of evidence? Where in these movements, they've only given you the one thing of throwing soup at the Mona Lisa, which I believe is a very extreme thing of what happens. Furthermore, the Mona Lisa didn't get damaged. It didn't really hurt any people in that thing. You have to understand that when the soup was thrown at the Mona Lisa did not get injured. No one really got hurt, and I don't think that's a very extreme case of radical that they're showing us. Yes.
Go search up the word radicalization. It means extreme. It means that on your side, you are saying that a lot of people will join a movement that is truly extreme. That means that usually only the minority of people support it.
I want you to understand that the point of the motion is that we believe that radicalization in the movement has done more to harm than good. But we're not stating that everyone should have done radicalizations. We still can have peaceful protests, but when it comes to the extreme cases where radicalization is needed, we are going to use it then. Because let me give you an example of when this happens. Because last time in I think around the late 90s, we had the Chimko movement. What was this movement? It was basically how we're trying to protect deforestation by just like tree hugging, and that's what the environment do. This is an example of radical movement that's not very extreme, that didn't hurt anyone, but instead save the forest, and that's something you can do. Can you explain to me how you could solve this deforestation movement without having this radical movement? I don't think you really could, and that's why deforestation is still happening nowadays. You have to understand that this movement is really needed. The Amazon rainforest is being cut down. What are you doing? You're saying that, oh yes, we should just have normal climate change. We should have normal change. The media is more on our side for the matter, as if the media won't really care about a few little things being posted, as they only want to see the extreme, only want to see the dramatized versions of things, right? Although so that's why we believe that having the more extreme can reach much more people. Okay, then, so I would like to bring my last bit of evidence that I want to bring into this whole debate, which is the Keystone Pipeline in 2021. Okay, so let me explain to you what this Keystone Pipeline was. This was a project between Canada and the US where they are trying to build a pipeline to transfer crude oil. So let me explain a few harms of this and the reason how it was stopped and how this will help our side of the case. Because first of all, there are many reasons why this is bad. Because first of all, it increases the greenhouse energy emissions because of the crude oil. It harms land and forests since we're digging underneath them, possibly having to deforest them. Third of all, their oil spills would probably be very common during this thing, and it will be a threat to the water supply and rivers. And last of all, it delays the transitions to clean energy. These are all the harms that comes with this project, and which the US and Canada has come to push. However, this project never got to see light, and for what reason? The reason was because these radical movements are what stopped that, and we believe that that's what we want to go for. As I said, we're only going to push this for the very big, and we're trying to help this as much as possible. So my last rebuttal that I have to give here is talking about rich CEOs and companies. People, the rich speaker said that they won't care. These rich countries, the rich companies, the rich people will not care. But I have to say that they will care. Listen, you have to understand that these rich CEOs, they can easily get sued by a lot of activists. For example, my speaker has already given you the Shell company of how they were sued because they had 45% of emission, right? They got sued for this and now are going under strict regulations from the government to make sure that it doesn't happen again. These rich companies, these rich CEOs are getting called out for their actions. And I don't think it's proper for you to not give us any evidence and say this is definitely not happening. Proud to oppose.
Thank you for that speech, Opip. Reversing the speaking order, calling on Opip reply.
Give me a moment to set up my timer, please. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Two things in this speech today. Number one, the people on the ground and the innocents, just as government has framed it. Secondly, CEOs, large corporations, and the wealthy up there. First thing, I like to say
Do you think the average individual who simply just feels the weather is getting hotter would actually do anything other than switch on the aircon and go back into their homes where they're safe and comfortable and they can continue scrolling on social media? No, that is highly unlikely for them to actually take any steps to do any meaningful change. Unlike what will happen on our world when they continue to scroll on social media and then they can see these movements happen. They see what's happening online and they realize that maybe the reason why their environment outside is like this is because of the dire need that we have, and we need to actually stand up and do and participate in climate change movements simply because they need to actually do this as it's affecting them. It doesn't mean they'll do anything other than that, other than when they see statistics online, as government has posed. They believe on government side that when people just share facts, read statistics in long lines and many words, people will now understand the dire need of climate change and they'll actually feel incentivized to do anything. This is highly unlikely, as I don't believe that anyone would be interested in reading statistics as a form of sharing a movement. No. Secondly, CEOs and wealthy people. Firstly, government has given to us a few reasons why that all these companies would probably control the media, pay news outlets. However, throughout my speech and my web speaker, we've already stated why this actually doesn't stop people from actively taking action against these CEOs if they want. Government paints them as untouchable beings. However, we beg to disagree, and it doesn't stop people from actually actively trying to sue them. They've also stated a really interesting thing about how these regular people have a fear of the rich, which is exactly the reason why we need these movements. We need these radical movements, because now we're showing the people who often believe they're higher than others and believe they have no need to be incentivized to do anything or take any change. We're showing them that they actually have to participate in this. It is also their responsibility to partake in these environmental movements, and they cannot simply just be left out simply because they have money and wealth to protect them from all the environmental effects that are going on in our world as of now. I also like to state how that government has given a really interesting point about people won't care about the intent of these environmental activists, even if they stand in front of their car. They'll just be mad that they're blocking their road, their time, and blocking them from going back home after a long day at work. However, we do agree to some extent, but this is a short-term thing. Firstly, when you have this, of course, you'll feel slightly frustrated. However, maybe later, when you think back to it, like later at night, you'll be able to think why they've done this. Oh my God, who are these crazy people who've actually chosen in the hot day to stand outside my car and to block me from going home after my long day of work? Who are these people? This is why when these people take these actions, it doesn't cause change immediately. However, it causes thinking. And we believe that this critical thinking is the essence of what actually causes change, simply because now these people are thinking, why are these activists doing this? I'm just me. Why are they doing it to me? And it makes them think of their own role and their importance in these movements themselves. Because if these are happening to them, it shows how the environmental movement and climate change will happen to them in the future too. It's basically telling them and foreshadowing how they also need to take and partake in these movements itself. And they've also mentioned on government side that we will not get consistent buy-in. However, they also fail to realize they wouldn't either on their side, which is more likely to fail on their side simply because no one really wants to read statistics online consistently in order to support a movement. Thank you.
All right. Calling on Goverplay to end this debate. Government reply whenever you're ready.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, again. Okay, I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Judge, you know how I felt listening to this whole debate? I felt like my brain was melting like ice kacang. 3 major contradictions and just really weird things in the entire op bench has done this debate. The first thing I want to tell you is that they ditch each other, like how the environmental movement does when you radicalize. Because no, how the first speaker comes up and tells you that middle ground people are not important, they cannot do anything. We would pressure the rich. He gave you zero mechanization for what happens. I already took this down. And I guess the second speaker saw that and went, shit, this doesn't work. Let's contradict my first speaker. And then they entirely pivoted their case to talk about why people were important and why they want to change the messaging of people. Note, Judge, that this means that they implicitly buy into the idea that critical mass is important and critical mass is the most instrumental mechanism by which you achieve change. But it's something that our case achieves better than them. But secondly, the concession during outbreak was an incredibly important one. Because when I asked him, do you know that radicalization means something's extreme? He goes, we're not saying that we want radicalization for everyone. Doesn't that mean that you're conceding that the idea of radicalization is just one that's bad in the first place? Next, I want to point out the new material in GovWhip, because he tells you the substantive label that there'll be more government cooperation. This is bad enough. But what's worse is that he's running new material with no mechanization. He's running new material and just proving it with examples. He tells you that X, Y, Z has happened, and this is good, this is bad. That's not how debating works. We've proven to you structurally that we have better that you work better with governments on our side, because the government views you as more measured people, because the government views you as more rational, because the government doesn't view you as a threat. This is where this is where you can sit down at the same table, where discourse can take space, where you talk directly to the government about policies because they have more respect for you. No, this is actual debating because we give structural reasons. We aren't just reading off like a random website, okay? Okay, but secondly, I'll move on to the actual debate. The first thing I'll talk about is that they implicitly like buy into the idea that critical mass is also important. So the delta within this debate then just becomes who better achieves critical mass. I want to talk about this broadly one thing from now on, which is how this affects people. Because the entire outpush in this debate is that number one, people don't care about the environment. Number two, you do some crazy things, they look at you, they will go, why are these people doing crazy things? And then they will start researching about the environment, and then they will start caring about the environment a lot. And then they'll start doing a lot of things for the environment. Look at the amount of logical leaps there and the lack of mechanization within those claims. Presumably, number one, people already care enough about the environment because they already told you how something is very proximate. But presumably, if you've been through any basic education system, it's something that they teach you in geography class, right? It's something every ECG class you go to, the teachers be like, the environment is bad. How about we list 3 ways we can save water? These are things that we all know and we are incredibly proximate to each other. But secondly, if you really want the answer of people, if their only mechanism is that you see people do crazy things and you wonder who are these people and why are we doing, we think the simple answer is that they are crazy people lah. And that's a likely framing and labeling I'm going to put onto them, right? And I already told you from my speech, this is the exact labeling that the extreme and the far right, people like Donald Trump, are likely going to slap onto you. So this is the point in which you lose a lot of support. But sure, I'll take them at their very, very best. Sure, some people will look at all of this and go, why are they doing this? Some people will read the messaging. Some people will do more for the environment. But you want to guess what? Those people probably just already care a lot about the environment. And on both sides, we think those people that they actually mobilize are going to just do things for the environment anyway. So I don't know what the delta within their case is. So at the end of the debate, Judge, what can you buy? I think number one, we've already told you how we have a unique mechanism or how we have a more measured movement, one that works better with the government. I think the end outcome of all of this is that number one, you get better actual change because you enact change within legislation. Now, this fills in that missing mechanism about how you actually achieve accountability for the rich. Because the rich can run away from random people shouting at them, random people writing blog posts about them. What they cannot run away is from the long arm of the law. We told you how the movement was sustainable, how it's likely going to go into the long term. For these reasons, I think it's incredibly clear. We take this debate by a huge margin.
Thank you for that speech, reply. So that concludes the debate. Speakers virtually cross the house and please go back to the main hall and they will be back for the result.
Thanks for the debate.
Thanks for the debate.